The world to come. The Restored Church of God presents David C. Pack, author of 80 books and booklets, editor-in-chief of the Real Truth magazine, read by countless and growing numbers in every nation and territory of the world. In a violent age full of war, famine, pollution, disease, disasters, and economic uncertainty, and ever-worsening bad news, answering life's greatest questions straight from the Bible and announcing the wonderful good news of the world to come. And now, David C. Pack.
Millions believe God exists. Few have proof or even no proof exists. Have you proven God exists? Or do you hope, suspect, feel, believe, think He does? Can His existence be scientifically proven? Can you know with certainty that an all-intelligent mind created the universe and all life on earth, including you? Must the answers be accepted on faith? This series covers the existence of God and will be among the most important you ever watch. In under 2 hours, you will see it is impossible for God not to exist. Not just improbable or that the case is strong, impossible. All doubt of His existence will vanish.
I watched every video of your series, and my doubts about God did not vanish. I'm still convinced that you believe in childish myths with no connection to reality. Your 5-part series took more than 2 hours, where you said it would take less, and it was not an important or significant video series compared to most of the others I've watched because you clearly have no idea what you're talking about. You're into one-way communication, books, booklets, videos, and comments disabled, where you talk and others listen. So you never hear any critique and never know how wrong you are about everything you say. You know as little about this subject as the average noob in a pew who never spoke to any educated person with an opposing view. If you never know what your mistakes are, you'll never correct them. That's why your whole series is nothing but parroting Pratts disputed in a previous century. The difference between knowledge and belief is that knowledge can be demonstrated. Knowledge is a subset of belief, but it's justified belief. And consequently, no one can honestly say they actually know anything about God, not even whether such a thing exists. We have no reason to believe in a God and lots of good reasons not to. Such can only be believed on faith, in lieu of evidence and in spite of evidence. You didn't present a strong case, you presented no case at all. Just baseless assertions pleading for an erroneous conclusion that was assumed without warrant. God's existence cannot be scientifically proven, not just because there is no such thing, but also because nothing can be proven in science. The only scientific application of proof is in mathematics. But if we were to define proof in the legal sense as an overwhelming preponderance of evidence, which is the context you are clearly using, then God's existence still can't be proven because there is not one fact that is positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with the God hypothesis over any other. Your incredulity is a logical fallacy. It does not count as evidence. Yet that is all you've provided. In fact, there is nothing supporting your hypothesis whatsoever. We can't even consider the possibility because no possibility has ever been established.
This series squarely faces basic questions. To those with an open mind, it will be life-changing.
Your series was not life-changing because although my mind is open, it is not empty. I know this topic very well. In fact, I know both sides of this argument better than you know your own alone. And you've demonstrated that you don't know anything about the scientific perspective whatsoever. So when you asked for an open mind, I think you meant a gullible one. My mind is definitely open, though, unlike yours. Yours is blinded by faith and a doctrinal obligation to defend the sacred fables against all reason. That's what apologetics is all about. You assume your conclusion at the onset for reasons that have nothing to do with factual information, and then you make up whatever excuse necessary to rationalize or justify your baseless assumptions regardless what the facts are. And I'm going to point that out and show you that that's what you've been doing. I should also add that admitting that you don't know whether God exists is not an assertion. No one knows that God exists. But that doesn't say anything about whether you believe there is a God. There are agnostic theists who say they believe in a God but can't say for sure who or what that God is. And most atheists are agnostic. They know it's not possible to know anything about anything supernatural, but neither do they believe in such things, at least not in a deity. And remember that a deity is essentially a magical anthropomorphic immortal, or in your case, an invisible genie. One that somehow controls absolutely everything that ever happens without any possible mechanisms to do that, and against all logical analysis. An atheist is someone who does not believe in any God. It is not necessarily someone who believes no God exists, although they can be that too. A belief is a conviction. A lack of belief is a lack of conviction. So if you're not convinced that an actual deity really exists, you're atheist, even if you identify as an agnostic. And I used to identify as agnostic for years until I found out what the word atheist really means. And most people who call themselves agnostic are also atheists and just don't realize that or won't acknowledge it. I don't consider myself agnostic anymore because I know there's no God, and I can justify that too, according to Christopher Hitchens' expression of the fundamental rules of logic, that positive claims require positive evidence, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and what has been asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. You've made an extraordinary claim for which you provided no evidence at all. The burden of proof is on you, and you get no benefit of the doubt because you've made an empty assertion.
Did all life on Earth evolve over millions of years, as evolutionists assert? Or did an all-powerful God author it? Most people assume evolution is true, just as millions assume God's existence. I also studied evolution versus creation in depth during the same period I sought to prove God's existence. I learned it takes far more faith to believe the intellectually fashionable evolutionary myth than that God exists. In fact, I learned evolution is based entirely on faith because no true facts or proof have ever been found to support it.
No? Well, what about the fact that evolution happens? That biodiversity and complexity do increase, and that both occur naturally only by evolutionary means. It is also a fact that alleles vary with increasing distinction in reproductive populations, and that these are accelerated in genetically isolated groups. It is a fact that natural selection, sexual selection, and genetic drift have all been proven to have predictable effect in guiding this variance. It is a fact that significant beneficial mutations do occur and are inherited by descendant groups, and that multiple independent sets of biological markers exist to trace these lineages back over many generations. It is a fact that birds are a subset of dinosaurs in the same way that humans are a subset of apes, primates, eutherian mammals, and that both groups are subsets of vertebrate deuterostome animals. It is a fact that the collective genome of all animals has been traced to its most basal form, and that those forms are also indicated by comparative morphology, physiology, and embryological development. It is a fact that every animal on Earth has definite relatives, either living nearby or evident in the fossil record, and indicated in phylogenetics. It is a fact that the fossil record holds hundreds of transitional species, even according to the strictest definition of that term. And it is a fact that microevolution and macroevolution have both been directly observed. These are facts, things we can objectively verify and prove to be true, beyond dispute. That means you can't dispute them. I know that because I've already had this conversation thousands of times, and the result is always the same. These facts definitely qualify as evidence, and not just because they stand against every concept of creationism, but also because they are both positively indicative of and exclusively concordant with evolution, which is the only theory of biodiversity with no possible alternative. That's why evolution is the foundation of modern biology, and creationism is literally a fairy tale, because it has giants, witches, magic spells, and talking animals with no connection to reality.
Sadly, there is not in every man knowledge of the true God. Such incredible ignorance and confusion.
Ignorance isn't just what you don't know, it's also what you won't know. Your ignorance is what you ignore. Faith requires a degree of willful ignorance, but my position would not allow that. I need evidence, and so do you if you're going to tell me what you know. If you can't show it, you don't know it. And the rules are the same for both of us.
Of course, some don't want this God to exist because if he does, they must obey him.
This was always the most irritating of Christian assertions for me because it's wrong so many ways. First of all, if we believed in God, there's nothing we'd have to obey. You don't have to pay attention to the 10 Commandments nor the rest of the 613 Commandments either. Now, Jesus said that you had to honor every jot and tittle of all those old Mosaic commandments, including those twisted rules in Leviticus. But he said that if you didn't obey the commandments, you'd still get into heaven. You'd just be called least when you were there. Well, so what? You're in, right? So if you love your sin, proclaim Jesus as your Savior, and then you can do whatever you want. Many Christians believe that once you're saved, you're always saved. Christ died for your sins. So if you don't sin, Christ died for nothing. It doesn't matter how evil you are. Every sin can be forgiven if you but believe. But if you don't believe, then it doesn't matter how good you are, because the only sin that will not be forgiven is the sin of disbelief. The only thing that matters is whether you believe the lies the clergy told you, which you're supposed to believe on faith in lieu of evidence simply because they said so. Thus, gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption, and the only thing that really pisses God off is when people don't believe in him, which is already an indication that God is just a story. No one, not one person I ever heard of, ever said that they didn't believe in God because they didn't want to obey him. Because pretending God doesn't exist won't make him go away. And pretending or professing to believe when you don't really believe, that won't work either. You can read minds, remember? So if you say you don't believe, you'd better be damned sure that he doesn't really exist. Even agnostics are willing to take that risk, which shows that there really is no risk at all. Theology is just a game of pretend, where people literally make believe. I don't believe because I'm not a pretender.
Now, before starting this study, remember, assumptions don't count. Neither do superstitious myths or traditions based on ignorance. What can be known from science? Only accept facts, think rationally and clearly, then accept what can be proven.
I'm going to hold you to that as I continue to critique every video in your series. So, do you accept each of the indisputable facts of evolution, which I've already shown and which can be and have been proven? You can look them up yourself. PubMed lists over 400,000 peer-reviewed articles on evolution and nearly 50,000 just on human evolution. And many of these, by the way, focus more on the genome than on fossils because, in some cases, genetics confirms precisely how our evolution happened, exactly which mutations of what type were involved with specific changes and how. So I suggest you take your own advice.
Be willing to accept science. As we reason, do not suppose or hope. Stand on indisputable facts.
There is no way you ever studied evolution at all, let alone in depth, like you said. Even if you did, which you didn't because you still don't know what it is, there's not much you could have learned if your lesson began and ended 50 years ago, and you still wouldn't know anything now. The scientific understanding of evolution has progressed substantially since then. I've forgotten more about this than you'll ever know. I've been actively and continuously advocating science education against the lies of creationism in the public forum for more than 20 years. In that time, there has been a paleontological boom with newly discovered transitions closing virtually every gap and a cladistic reformation of Linnaean taxonomy, which proves the case as solidly as any genetic paternity test. These and the other facts I listed are things we know and can show to be true of evolution, where you can't show anything you actually know about God. You're trying to prove your magic imaginary friend by showing your own ignorance and deceit. This isn't just my opinion either. I'll continue to prove the point as I critique the rest of your video series where you have consistently failed to imply a God.
Today, there are more than 200 known parameters necessary for a planet to support life, every single one of which must be perfectly met or the whole thing falls apart. Without a massive planet like Jupiter nearby, for instance, whose gravity will draw away asteroids, 1,000 times as many would hit Earth's surface. The odds against life in the universe are simply astonishing. Grasp what you are reading.
Firmly grasp it.
Can every one of those many parameters have been perfect by accident? At what point is it fair to admit that science suggests we cannot be the result of random forces? Doesn't assuming that an intelligence created these perfect conditions require far less faith than believing a life-sustaining Earth just happened to beat the inconceivable odds to come into being?
Thank you for once again admitting that faith is a belief that is not based on the indications of evidence, but rather on improbable assumptions that are not indicated by evidence.
Remember, assumptions don't count. Neither do superstitious myths or traditions based on ignorance.
So there is no reason ever to assume a God from the ignorant, superstitious myths of any ancient culture.
As we reason, do not suppose or hope. Stand on indisputable facts.
Exactly. So by your own impeccable logic, there is no point at which we should assume anything that is not indicated by evidence. Instead, we should
think rationally and clearly.
Thank you for making my point for me.
The fine-tuning necessary for life to exist on a planet is nothing compared with the fine-tuning required for the universe to exist at all. For example, astrophysicists now know that the values of the 4 fundamental forces, gravity, the electromagnetic force, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, were determined less than 1/1,000,000th of a second after the Big Bang. Alter any one value and the universe could not exist. For instance, if the ratio between the nuclear strong force and the electromagnetic force had been off by the tiniest fraction of the tiniest fraction, by even 1 part in 100 followed by 15 zeros, then no stars could have ever formed at all. Stunning. Multiply that single parameter by all the other necessary conditions, and the odds against the universe existing are so heart-stoppingly astronomical that the notion that it all just happened defies common sense. It would be like tossing a coin and having it come up heads 10 quintillion times in a row.
It seems that deceptively alleged mathematic probabilities are the last sleight-of-hand card trick that creationists have. It's a simple illusion because it's easy to make the numbers lie if you can't verify any of the terms of your equation, and such is the situation here. The article you're citing was written by Eric Metaxas, a Christian apologist and author whose best-selling book was criticized by scholars as unhistorical, theologically weak, and philosophically naive. That's when he was writing about history. When he wrote about science, he earned similar condemnation from scientists who say he is misrepresenting the facts and figures. Of the many posted rebuttals from scientists, the most famous came from theoretical physicist and cosmologist Lawrence Krauss, which was featured in the New Yorker. Krauss said, "No, astrobiology has not made the case for God. We currently do not know the factors that allow for evolution of life in the universe. We know the many factors that were important here on Earth, but we do not know what set of other factors might allow a different evolutionary history elsewhere." The mistake made by the author is akin to saying that if one looks at all the factors in my life that led directly to me sitting at the computer to write this, one would obtain a probability so small as to conclude that it is impossible that anyone else could ever sit down to compose a letter to the Wall Street Journal. We found many more planets around stars in our galaxy than were previously imagined, and many more forms of life existing in extreme environments on our planet than were known when the early estimates for the frequency of life in the universe were first made. If anything, the odds have increased, not decreased. The universe would certainly continue to exist even if the strength of the 4 known forces was different. It is true that if the forces had slightly different strengths, but nowhere near as tiny as the fine-scale variation asserted by the writer, then life as we know it would probably not have evolved. This is more likely an example of life being fine-tuned for the universe in which it evolved rather than the other way around. Metaxas' article in the Wall Street Journal wasn't just blasted by experts in the field of science, it was also condemned by theologians. Quoting from the Gospel Herald, biblical scholars refute Eric Metaxas' Wall Street Journal article. Dr. Peter Enns, a biblical scholar, argues that there are 2 main reasons why Metaxas' article falters. First off, the notion that our theology, specifically our understanding of God, is our sure starting point for deliberating about the relationship between science and faith. He cites his recent book, Evolution of Adam, in regards to the fact that we should not assume that how we think about God is the unmovable and firm starting point for further deliberations, and pushing the boundaries of our understanding of physical reality might actually affect the kind of God we understand ourselves to be proving. And his second point refers to the fact that we can't really stand behind God as a thing or being that can stand under scientific scrutiny. God is not a being whose existence can be pointed out here or there, Enns says. God is being, the ground of being, that by which all being, all existence is made possible. That is the claim of the Christian faith, and to fall short of that claim is to sell this God short. Metaxas didn't just get condemnation from the Christian perspective, but Jewish as well. In an article in the Huffington Post, Rabbi Jeffrey Mittelman said, "Sorry, science doesn't make the case for God, but that's okay. Science is in constant flux. New discoveries are made, new insights arise, new paradigms overturn previous ways of thinking. So if we base our religious outlook on scientific findings, what will happen to our theology when the science changes?" Rabbi Mittelman then cited Francis Collins and Carl Giberson, Christians who are also scientists. They said the fine-tuning argument must not be too quickly fashioned into an argument for the existence of God. Like all apologetic arguments, it can be undermined by new discoveries and weakened by broad theological conversations. Now, given the type of audience that you have, I would expect that you'd want to open with your best argument. And having already seen each of the other videos in your series, I think you've done that this was the best argument that you had. And look what's left of it now. If this was the best you can do, then what does that imply about everything else in your series that we've yet to discuss? I'm embarrassed for you, but that's not going to stop me from disputing, refuting, and absolutely disproving every one of the erroneous assertions that you somehow mistook for indisputable, irrefutable, absolute proof of something that isn't really real.
In 1968, scientists built an atomic clock that uses cesium-133 atoms because they vibrate at the rate of 9,192,631,770 times per second. This is accurate to within 1 second every 30 million years. Imagine your watch was that accurate. Cesium-133 atoms never vary a single vibration. They are steady, constant, reliable, and cannot be an accident of nature that just happens to always turn out exactly the same.
Why not? How would you know? Why can't the properties of natural elements be natural? I think you're saying that because you don't know what you're talking about. You remind me of this guy.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
You're assuming your conclusion. Elemental atomic structures and chemical compounds have natural properties as an inevitable consequence of their configuration. Add the right number of atomic particles with the appropriate bonds, and this is what happens. There is no designer apparent, necessary, or even possible. That's why nothing matches whatever we want to measure, not even days or years. It's no different whether we measure time, space, warps in space-time, or any other dimension. For example, a gram is an absolute weight of a cubic centimeter of water at temperature of melting ice, or 4 degrees Celsius. Likewise, a meter is the length of the path traveled by light in a vacuum during a time interval of 1/299,792,458 of a second. We have a constant for the speed of light most of the time, but not for much else. Most everything else in the universe appears to be incidental arrangements shifting balance in what is usually a chaotic mess.
Saying the universe came into existence from nothing violates the first law of thermodynamics, established by the very scientific community now willing to ignore it.
They're not ignoring it. And since you've demonstrated that you have no idea what you're talking about and everything you've said so far is wrong, then I can't trust anything you say and we'll have to defer to the experts. In this case, physics professor Lawrence Krauss, PhD, author of A Universe from Nothing.
The simplest kind of nothing is the kind of nothing of the Bible, say an infinite empty space, an infinite dark void of the Bible. You know, nothing in it, no particles, no radiation, nothing. Well, that kind of nothing turns out to be full of stuff in a way, or at least much more complicated than you might have imagined, because due to the laws of quantum mechanics and relativity, we now know that empty space is a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles that are popping in and out of existence at every moment. And in fact, for that kind of nothing, if you wait long enough, you're guaranteed by the laws of quantum mechanics to produce something. So the difference between empty space with stuff in it and empty space with nothing in it is not that great anymore. In fact, they're different versions of the same thing. So the transition from nothing to something is not so surprising.
See, we always said that the most ingenious people capable of figuring out anything were rocket scientists and brain surgeons. Well, at least we can still say that about rocket scientists.
Regarding the second law of thermodynamics, universally accepted scientific law, which states that all things left to themselves will tend to run down, or the law of entropy, it is observed It would hardly be possible to conceive of two more completely opposite principles than this principle of entropy increase and the principle of evolution. Each is precisely the converse of the other. As Aldous Huxley defined it, evolution involves a continual increase of order, of organization, of size, of complexity. It seems axiomatic that both cannot possibly be true. But there is no question whatever that the second law of thermodynamics is true.
You just presented Henry Morris as if he were an evolutionist, meaning someone who accepts mainstream science as opposed to dogmatic belief in magical fairy tales. But Henry Morris never accepted or even understood evolution. He founded the Institute for Creation Research, an anti-science apologetics ministry whose mission is to mislead and deceive those who would have otherwise understood and accepted science and consequently discard the sacred fables on which their form of religious extremism depends. Now, even if you meant to refer to Morris's mention of Huxley, Thomas Huxley was an evolutionary scientist. Aldous Huxley was not. Aldous was a mystic, and he apparently did not understand that evolution does not require a continuous increase in order, organization, size, or even complexity. All of these can stagnate or fluctuate. Just to clarify, no evolutionist ever, not even one, ever agreed that the second law of thermodynamics posed any kind of problem for evolution because, and you forgot to mention this, that law only applies to a closed system. But that doesn't matter here because the Earth is not a closed system. Evolution, like all aspects of biology, derives its energy from the sun. So the reason that McDonald's became an increasingly complex and highly prolific international company is the same reason that evolution works also.
Evolutionists have seized on many theories within the overall theory in an attempt to explain the origins of plants, animals, the heavens, and the earth. Over and over, these theorists try to explain how life evolved from inanimate material into more complex life forms until reaching the pinnacle, human beings. Yet, as one geologist wrote, it must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have been debunked.
I've been arguing with creationists regularly for decades, so I know how they use out-of-context quote mining. We'll get into more of that later in this series. The quote you're talking about now was first cited by Duane Gish from the Institute of Creation Research. I tried to find the complete original comment and finally found it referenced by Kenneth Saladin, who debated Gish. Saladin said, "I couldn't find Ager's paper in the library anywhere, and librarians of 2 campuses told me that no such journal had ever existed as Gish cited. So finally I wrote to Ager, and I have his letter with me tonight if you'd like to see it." Ager says, first of all, Gish got the name of the journal and the year of the publication wrong, but then he did enclose the paper Gish meant to cite. Now, the complete sentence Dr. Gish alludes to reads, "It must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student, from Truman's Austria-Graphia to Carruthers' Zaffrentis Delanoë, have been debunked. This makes it sound like evolution wholesale has been debunked." Ager was only talking about the evolution of Ostrea, which is oyster-like bivalve mollusks, from Graphia, another bivalve, and saying that previous interpretations of the relationship had been mistaken. So no, your source misrepresented Ager. He did not imply that any significant concept in evolution had ever been debunked, and this quote was mined out of context and stripped of some of its original content to create a deliberately deceptive illusion. In other words, it's a lie. There are no theories within a theory either, but I'll explain to you what a theory is and how that works in a later video. For now, I'll just point out that humans are not the pinnacle of evolution, and even Darwin knew that 150 years ago.
Many evolutionists have tried to argue that humans are 99% similar chemically to apes, and blood precipitation tests do indicate that the chimpanzee is people's closest relative. Yet regarding this, we must observe the following. Milk chemistry indicates that the donkey is man's closest relative. Cholesterol level tests indicate that the garter snake is man's closest relative. Tear enzyme chemistry indicates that the chicken is man's closest relative. On the basis of another type of blood chemistry test, the butter bean is man's closest relative. More people should weep for evolutionists.
Don't patronize me. You're the one who's pathetic. What you just said was the most inane argument I've ever heard from any creationist, and that's saying something. I'm stunned by the unprecedented stupidity of the various comparisons you made just now. I don't trust anything Henry Moore has ever said, and if he got everything wrong here, that would be consistent with everything I've ever read from him, but I'm not going to look up these other items because they don't matter. I'm only going to focus on the important one. Our similarity to chimpanzees was not determined by any blood precipitation test. We're not talking about impurities in the blood, we're talking about DNA. And I suspect that you already knew that, and that you paraphrased this so that you would conceal what we're really talking about. Our relationship to other apes was confirmed genetically using the same technology as a paternity test to prove who your daddy really is, and that's exactly what it did. This happened multiple ways, and this is important. First, we can use genetic markers, specific mutations that have appeared in and are unique to particular ethnic regions. And through genetic sequence analysis, scientists with the Genographic Project have mapped genetic patterns of human ancestral migration. Then there's mitochondria, which is actually a disabled infectious bacteria trapped within our own cells, and which our cells depend on to exist. How's that for intelligent design? Mitochondria has its own DNA, separate from ours, and that has a fairly regular mutation rate, which can be used to estimate ages. It is also exclusively inherited from the mother. So this, in concert with genomic sequence analysis, will only trace your maternal lineage and can provide a reasonable estimate of time, such that we know that your great-great-great, etc. grandmother was also mine, and she lived in Africa 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, part of a larger population. There's actually a string of mitochondrial Eves. Endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs, account for about 8% of the human genome, and they too can be treated as genetic markers and precisely matched to distantly related groups, showing where certain infections were inherited by a common ancestor at some point in the past. Some of these are common to all humans, and they match ERVs of the same type and location in the genome of apes and monkeys, proving a familial relationship with them as well. Finally, there's the most important one. We can trace the course of our evolution using protein functional redundancy. The more correlated sequences of ubiquitous genes in different organisms, the closer they're related. It's no coincidence that our genome is so similar to the other apes. It is the string of chemical instructions of how we develop. That's why it is so significant that we share almost all of our DNA with chimps, and that 96% of that is long strings of hundreds of codons at a time that match precisely. That really is demonstrable, verifiable, absolute proof that we evolved from apes.
Dr. B.G. Ranganathan said, "The probability of life originating from accident is comparable to the unabridged dictionary resulting from an explosion in a printing shop."
I get the impression that you've never spoken to an actual scientist. You certainly never read the work of any actual scientists. For example, Babu Ranganathan was never a scientist and has no degrees in science. He's not a doctor either. A doctor is someone who has earned or was awarded a PhD, which generally follows a master's degree. There are a number of creationists who pretend to have doctoral degrees but really don't, and don't even have a master's either. In colloquial terms, people who pretend to have degrees or expertise they don't really have are practicing quackery. You can also call them charlatans, or you can call them frauds, because that's what they are. The man you're calling doctor only has a bachelor's degree, and it's not even a Bachelor of Science, it's a Bachelor of Arts, and he got that from Bob Jones Fundamentalist Christian University, where we shouldn't expect that anyone on the whole faculty knows dick about evolution. I read a review of Ranganathan's book on Amazon, and it said that if you can make it through 10 pages of this tract without finding numerous errors of the most basic science, you may need to go back to junior high. And based on that, I think you might look out of place taking remedial lessons in a classroom full of 8th graders.
And this only speaks to the likelihood of any life at all, rather than the most highly complex forms such as large animals or human beings. What of all the millions of kinds of life existing today?
There are no kinds of life. A kind is a false taxon invented by creationists trying to conceal the truth of taxonomy, how it always only ever reveals a cladistic phylogeny with a branching tree pattern of common ancestors. Creationists cannot discern any specially created kinds, as they would absolutely have to if there was any truth to their position at all. Neither can they appropriately use words like species, genus, order, or phylum for the same reason. The phylogeny challenge is the ultimate damnation of creationism, the proof that it cannot be true, and that ultimately evolution is definitely, demonstrably, and verifiably true. A systematic classification of life forms reveals a successive series of descendant groups within parental categories, like a set of Russian Matryoshka dolls. These categories are inextricably interconnected such that every organism on Earth is evidently related to everything else, and that every new species that ever emerged was a modified version of whatever its ancestors were. Biodiversity at every level is a matter of incremental, superficial changes being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarities, which are how clades are identified. This is exactly what Darwin described, and if you don't understand this, you don't understand evolution.
You will see that Darwin would today say his theory has failed utterly. Its many breakdowns mean it cannot be true. He would say this. Sadly, he's not here to tell us to drop his theory, that it's false. If only people would believe Charles Darwin's own rules governing his ideas, no one would believe evolution. Back from the grave, he would be the first to disown the theory of evolution.
No, he wouldn't. If Darwin were alive today, he'd have won the Nobel Prize for his discovery. I wish you were open to two-way conversation, but the reason you're not is that all of your claims are false. You can't list any of these many breakdowns because Darwin's theory hasn't had any breakdowns. Darwin made many specific predictions, which should only be true if his theory was right, and nearly all of them have been confirmed. Darwin proposed a process of natural selection, and since his time, field biologists have demonstrated natural selection in action numerous times. Darwin predicted that there should be transitional species discovered in the fossil record, and since then, other scientists have found hundreds and hundreds of them, with many of those lineages now effectively complete, including our own. There are no more missing links anymore. The first of those discoveries occurred within Darwin's lifetime. Darwin recognized that the limbs of birds look like the limbs of dinosaurs, but with the fingers fused together. So he predicted that there should be an ancient bird discovered with unfused wing fingers. Such should not exist unless evolution is true, and the first example out of many was discovered just a couple years later. Darwin also predicted the discovery of Precambrian fossils, and now we know of several. And Darwin also argued that the Earth had to be at least hundreds of millions of years old, and he said that humans living today were the same race, which in his time meant that they were all the same species, and he said that our species first occurred in Africa. He also realized that offspring inherit units of information from both father and mother. He didn't know about genetics. He couldn't figure that part out. But the discoveries of other scientists soon filled that gap. Every relevant discovery to date continues to support or confirm Darwin's theory, which is why evolution is now the foundation of modern biology, and Darwin would have every reason to be proud of that fact were he around today.
Organisms are all complicated, some wonderfully so, and yet they cannot be reduced, diminished, or simplified in complexity. They had to come into being exactly as they are, because they never could have arrived at their present condition gradually.
But every scientific paper relating to these subjects say they did, and they explain how they did. Now, you can either examine the situation and look at all the indications of how it came about, or you can imagine that it came pre-assembled according to a magic spell cast by an invisible man. However, history has consistently shown that the second route will never result in either a right answer or a useful one.
It is not possible for a code of any kind to arise by chance or accident. A code is the work of an intelligent mind. Even the cleverest dog or chimpanzee could not work out a code of any kind. It is obvious then that chance cannot do it. This could no more have been the work of chance or accident than could the Moonlight Sonata be played by mice running up and down the keyboard of my piano. Codes do not arise from chaos.
But we're not talking about chaos, are we? At least not chaos as you would imagine it. We're talking about properties of emergent complexity arising from an inherently ordered system. We'll talk more about emergence in a later video. For the moment, I'll call your attention to Benoit Mandelbrot, inventor of the fractal. He said that infinite complexity can spring from a system that is based on a few simple rules. Remember what I said in a previous video, that most of the time whenever creation scientists have actual degrees, they tend to comment on fields that are unrelated to their training? For example, your source, E.H. Andrews, is an engineer, like Mandelbrot. But we're talking about genetics, aren't we? I'm not a geneticist either, but I do know a couple, including my friend Concordance, who is a regular co-host on the Magic Sandwich Show podcast. He and I argue that DNA is not a code in the sense that you're using, where words or letters are only symbols substituted to mean something else. The letters in DNA aren't actual letters, they're abbreviations of the chemical components. So DNA is more like a computer code, where we're not substituting symbols conveying a message to be interpreted by someone else. These aren't just the coded commands either. These are the physical components that actually do stuff. DNA is a material, three-dimensional molecule causing chemical reactions. So it isn't like any code ever produced by any known intelligence. It's not the only autocatalytic self-replicating molecule either. There are others, including RNA. And this gets to your contention about DNA originating by chance. I made a classroom supplement science video to explain this to 8th graders, and as we've established in a previous video, your knowledge of science is almost at that level. So I'll play you a clip. With that established, scientists then had to show how the most important ingredient came about, the extremely complex macromolecule known as DNA. There's another version of genetics called RNA, and activated RNA actually builds DNA. Some viruses don't have DNA, but they do have RNA, and this led many scientists to hypothesize life beginning in an RNA world. RNA and DNA are both made of many times repeated components called nucleotides. It took a while, but researchers have shown how RNA nucleotides could have formed naturally in conditions now expected of the prebiotic Earth. In 2009, organic chemist John Sutherland at the University of Manchester showed how a specific cocktail of relatively simple chemicals became increasingly complex after several cycles of repeated inundation, dehydration, and irradiation. Once the mix became sufficiently complex, after enough repetition, a plausible phosphate was introduced, and the mix spontaneously transformed into ribonucleotides, the precursor of nucleic acids, the building blocks of RNA and DNA. Dr. Sutherland remarked that his laboratory conditions were like the warm little pond which Darwin speculated might be how life first emerged, provided that pond evaporated, got heated, and then it rained, and then the sun shone. Interestingly, the pathway from simple chemistry to complex chemistry to basic biology involves multiple mediums, repeatedly heating and cooling, dousing and drying. This is generally expected to be in solution, optimally near underwater geothermal vents or in volcanic pools near a shoreline. Other scientists had already shown that by dripping solutions of amino acids or RNA nucleotides onto a particular type of clay, it produced polymers, nucleotide precursors spontaneously assembled into RNA strands, even without the help of enzymes or ribosomes. Another team of researchers at Harvard showed how RNA could even duplicate itself without the normally necessary enzyme. An enzyme is a catalytic molecule which reacts to other molecules performing certain functions. They can metabolize food in digestion, or they can help rapidly replicate macromolecules, or make new copies of RNA. In fact, the enzyme itself is actually made of RNA. When double-stranded RNA is heated and divides, one strand contorts into a ribosome and the other becomes a template to be copied. Within the field of abiogenesis research, also known as prebiotic chemistry, there are literally dozens of concordant hypotheses, almost all of which could be true at the same time. Scientists have even composed protocells with some degree of metabolic processes, something similar to the hypothesized hypercycle. So it seems like the whole hypothesis has already been substantiated, but not quite yet. What we have established so far is that yes, all of this really can happen by accident, or as you would put it, by chance.
DNA could not have gradually come into existence. Special creation is required for DNA to exist.
By special creation, you're talking about a creative miracle. Remember that a miracle is the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural events in ways which are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of nature. This is the same definition as magic. So you are literally saying that it had to be poofed out of nothing by magic. Magical miracles or miraculous magic are never required for anything in reality. As we've already seen, DNA is created by RNA, and RNA really can spontaneously create itself given the right sequence of normal, natural, prior conditions. Now, this is all new information. 10 years ago, we didn't know this, and special creation wasn't required then either, because there is never a point where scientists can just throw up their hands and say, I don't know how it works, so it must be magic. And if they had said that back then, they would have been wrong today. And if they say it today, they'll be wrong 10 years from now. So you can't do it. And the only way to know what you know is to test what you think you know and make sure it works. Do you know it, or do you only believe that you do? So all hypotheses have to be testable. That means they necessarily have to be natural, because you can't test the supernatural. I mean, if it were real, you could. The things you see on Star Trek or Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and so on, people would be able to do that in real life too. And then you would be able to test the supernatural with reliable results. But since we can only do that in fictional fantasies, then here in the real world we have to limit hypotheses to things that are indicated by actual factual evidence that we can test. In which case, evolution has survived every test applied by the greatest minds of our time, while creationism can't survive any scrutiny at all.
Where did all life on earth come from? How did it get here? The Bible declares that God created all living things during the first 6 days of the creation week. Is this true?
Vedic scripture is many centuries older than the Bible, and it attributes creation to a dream of Brahma lasting 4,328,000,000 years. Coincidentally, scientists say that's pretty close to the age of our Earth. So I guess time is running out. But is this true? Enuma Elish is the oldest of all known creation myths written by the great-grandfathers of the biblical authors. It has the world being created in 7 generations of gods. The 6th generation created man to complete creation so that the 7th divine generation could rest. Is this true? The Coptic Gospels from Egypt say that the goddess of wisdom created your God, the Father God, out of an abortion of darkness and chaos. Then faith and wisdom hid themselves away so that when your God awoke, he thought he was the only thing that existed. Is this true? In fact, every ancient culture has their own creation myths, some just as strange as the Bible. Frost giants, the rainbow serpent, the cosmic egg, are they true? The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy says the Earth was created by a commercial engineering firm so that mice could perform experiments on humans. Is this true? Now, your Bible is a man-made mixture of myths and legends that includes a few names and places that are real and might even have some partially true accounts jumbled in with all those discordant tales. But the big important stuff you're talking about right now have no truth to them at all. They're not just allegorical metaphors, they're entirely made up, imagined out of nothing by ignorant primitives who obviously had no idea what they were talking about. Then those original tales were later adapted and appropriated by the men who produced what are now considered to be the first of the sacred fables of the Bible. The Bible has been proven wrong on every testable claim that it makes. It is not even possibly true, because everything in it is impossible. The stories in Genesis were evidently adapted from Enuma Elish and the epics of Gilgamesh and Ahatrahasis, along with some astrological lore, and were brought out of Mesopotamian polytheism around 450 BCE. An important note about all this type of folklore is that there is a word to describe the type of story that has a moral and includes magic spells like incantations, potions, wands, golems, and that center on folklorish characters like witches, wizards, dragons, and animals that talk and act like people. Those type of stories are called fairy tales. And not even children should wonder if they're really true.
When examining tiny organisms like protozoa and bacteria, it can be demonstrated that life only comes from life. There are many kinds of life, but each continues to reproduce the same kind over and over. This is indisputable.
Sorry, but I have to dispute that. One of the many repeatedly demonstrated facts of evolution is the many observances of speciation, where one species becomes 2 or more, and they're physically and genetically distinct from each other, such that if they reproduce sexually, they can no longer interbreed, so they no longer produce the same kind. Of course, you might argue that some new species of fruit fly or cichlid fish is still a fly, or it's still a fish. Well, flies and fish are both animals, so they're still the same kind. Every new species that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were, no matter how many different kinds may be produced. So at what point do we draw the line from one kind to another? The only taxonomic level with any functional definition is the level of species. And as I've pointed out in an earlier episode, there is no determinable definition for kinds of life.
Science has unwittingly demonstrated God's existence while simultaneously debunking evolution.
You never said anything in this segment of your video that even relates to evolution. You certainly haven't debunked anything. But if you think the laws of thermodynamics disprove evolution, then you're going to love this. Jeremy England, assistant professor of physics at MIT, has derived a mathematical formula that he says explains the origin of life. And the scientific community seems pretty excited about it. His formula, based on established physics, indicates that when a group of atoms is driven by an external source of energy like the sun or chemical fuel and is surrounded by a heat bath like the ocean or the atmosphere, it will gradually restructure itself in order to dissipate increasing energy. And this could mean that under certain conditions, matter inexorably acquires the key physical characteristics associated with life. In an ideal environment like the Earth, his theory renders the development of subsequent evolution not just probable, but inevitable.
Get this. They do not want a God telling them what to do. They cannot have that. In their world, God must not exist. They want you to agree because, like misery, darkness also loves company.
Settle down there, Don Knotts, before you have an aneurysm. Of all the bewildering inanity you've blurted out so far, this was your most profoundly illogical. The light of reason is not darkness, and understanding is not misery. But more importantly, God doesn't tell people what to do, and even if he did, nobody listens. If you love sin, accept Jesus and all will be forgiven. But the only thing that really pisses God off is when you don't believe in him, which is another indication that he's not really real, that this is just something desperate deceivers say when they're trying to sell their bullshit. If we had any reason to believe there is a God, why would we pretend there isn't? Would that make him go away? If he was real, then no. But in this case, yes, he would. Because God isn't real. He only exists in your mind and only when you fixate on such things. Get over it. I know a few pastors who have given up on God and they're all much happier now.
Christ's listeners saw he spoke with authority. So do I. Speaking truth with facts allows this.
No, sir. You've spoken no truth and have no facts to support you. You are a lying, ignorant ass. You feign authority because the religious mindset somehow cares more about the appearance of confidence than it does about actual factual accuracy, and you have been completely wrong about every point you've tried to make. The reason you're so confident is because you don't know anything. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a study showing the inability to gauge one's own incompetence. The more you know you don't know, and this generates humility. So those who are very competent tend to underestimate their own ability, while those who don't know dick about jack act like they're better than all the world's best educated expert specialists in any field. And that's you all over. Religion is all about pretending to know what you don't really know, and you're an expert at that, but only because you're too stupid to know how stupid you are. Charles Darwin recognized this 150 years before Dunning-Kruger, and his observation of your type of behavior prompts my favorite quote from him. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge.
Every time man tries to improve or alters food, he pollutes, ruins, devitalizes, injects with poison, genetically re-engineers, or in some manner reduces its perfection into something inferior to what he started with.
Every time, huh? Without exception? Just look at the foods you show in your own slides. Do you think this is what we started with? No. We've altered or modified all of that. For example, before we started using artificial selection and hybridization to genetically engineer peaches, they look like this. And when we first got a hold of oranges, they look like this. But after we cultivated them to derive and blend our favorite strains, taking advantage of new mutations, we end up with this. It tastes much better and is better to eat than the original, and this one doesn't even have seeds. It can't reproduce without our help. You have slides of seedless watermelons, but look how watermelons started out. That's not like any watermelon you've probably seen, but that's because you're eating a agriculturally cultivated strain of the original thing. Same with bananas. People have been cultivating bananas for 1,000 years, and yet there are a few different types. When they're ripe, they're either brown, yellow, red, purple, or they always stay green. The original food banana is a green Asian plantain, which is crammed full of large, hard seeds amid a hardcore matrix that is virtually inedible unless softened by cooking. There's another more common wild-type banana that has noxious seeds and is so rigid inside that you still can't chew it and wouldn't want to, even if it was cooked. And this soft-tissued cultivar is from a mutant strain which first appeared in Jamaica in 1836. Since then, many other cultivars have been developed from them so that we now have these 5-sided seedless varieties. That's how evolution works in agriculture.
Consider the over 1 million different kinds of animals, plus the estimated 12 million kinds of insects.
I've heard estimates that there are 12 million species of insects, although that estimate is less than half of the other end of that range. It seems that when you say kinds, you're really talking about species, and that'll be important in a later video in the series. For the moment, I should just point out that insects are animals too. An animal is defined as any organism consisting of multiple diploid eukaryotic cells whose gametes have a posterior flagella, and, most importantly, which must ingest other organisms in a digestive tract in order to survive. And this definition includes insects, and it includes people, too. Like plants, as well as fungus and other living things, animals like us are classified in a taxonomic hierarchy of descendant-daughter groups nested within a series of ancestral parent groups. And again, this only makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Carolus Linnaeus, who first designed this classification in the 1700s, was a pre-Darwinian creationist, and he couldn't begin to make sense of the taxonomic divisions that he discovered and that only evolution could explain. Now, plants are able to produce their own food, but according to your story, God didn't want us to have that ability. He wanted to make sure that we had to kill living cells in order to fuel our already imperfect dependent bodies. And obviously, the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the fruit of the tree of eternal life are both parables intended to refer to the results of our choices. And every other time that that appears in the Bible, that's exactly what that means. But in this one instance, you think it actually happened. So I have to ask, given that Adam had a chance to eat from the fruit of eternal life, what would have happened if he hadn't eaten from either tree?
Because these creatures are animate, they are even more marvelous and fascinating than our plants. But their diversity in color, shape, size, beauty, and lifespan is much like plants.
And why do you think that is? Could it be that we share half our DNA with them? Are they not eukaryotes whose cells are infested with symbiotic bacteria just as ours are? Just as in any other field of science, there are laws specific to evolution, which evolution also has to follow. And I made a video listing these. The point is that everything that exists confirms to these laws, and not one created being does. Every sort of animal or plant that men have ever made up for movies or mythology or whatever, all violate taxonomy, every single one of them, because a creator can put feathered wings onto monkeys if he wants to, or put a brain inside a plant, but evolution can't do any of that. So it is important to note that there is not one species anywhere which implies a magical creator rather than an evolutionary ancestor. And both plants and animals, as well as fungus and other things, are all in that taxonomic tree together.
The point? As fascinating, marvelous, beautiful, and amazing as are all the things described here, nothing is as amazing as the human mind. It is the absolute pinnacle of all living organisms. None can doubt this.
I've learned to doubt everything you say. For the moment, it is fair to say that the human mind is the most developed in the animal kingdom, largely because of the physical advantages we have over, say, dolphins. The dolphin brain is probably just as capable as ours, but not in that body. They have no hands, and they live in an environment where it is impossible to use hands, either to make tools or to harness fire. It's really unfortunate for them. Elephants, too, probably could develop to our level if they had some means of manipulating objects better than through their nose. It's also helpful if you're a coordinated predator, because that helps build teamwork skills. And there are some really smart birds out there, too, but they have the same problem. So there's really no way these other animals could develop that at the accelerated rate that we did. For another injustice, look at raccoons. They have hands, and they can stand and walk when they have to. They have every advantage to use a large and powerful brain, but they didn't get that. Dolphins did. A group that can never do anything with it. That's why I laugh whenever anyone talks to me about intelligent design.
Don't insult yourself. Don't suggest your extraordinary creative powers of intelligence, reason, logic, thought, volition, and ingenuity are a product of dumb luck.
Accepting reality as it is need not be an insult. Evolution has always been a source of fascination for me. I've studied it with interest since I was a little boy. And what I know about it now means that it would be an insult to my intelligence to pretend instead that my ancestors were magically conjured according to any of the obvious myths and fables to which you hold dear. None of that is even possibly true, and you should stop trying to fool people who know better than you.
Horseman was based on what turned out to be the skull cap of a donkey.
No, What you're calling Orseman wasn't a skull cap, but a skull fragment, one which could have been from a hominid, as indicated in this picture, or it could have been from a baby equid, but not necessarily a donkey, or it could have been from something else. The fossil isn't an important one because it's still never been identified despite numerous studies, so it's a little dishonest to say that it came from a donkey, as if there was any way that anyone could know that.
Ramapithecus man was simply a baboon skull.
No one calls it Ramapithecus man, and the reason they never did is because it's considered an ancestor of today's orangutans. It could not be confused with any baboon, which live on a different continent.
Piltdown man was an outright hoax.
A hoax perpetuated against evolutionary scientists and which was discovered and refuted by evolutionary scientists. If creationists knew how to expose a hoax, there wouldn't be creationists anymore.
And Neanderthal man was later determined to be severely bow-legged because he had rickets.
They found hundreds of Neanderthal men, women, and children and their DNA confirming a genetic distinction from Homo sapiens. None of them had rickets, but they all do show a suite of morphological distinctions from modern humans. And the more recent finds show more exaggerated distinctions, just as you would expect from a group that branched off our lineage and began growing apart their own way.
He was not proof from the fossil record of a half-ape, half-man transitional creature.
Nor were they ever supposed to be. Neanderthals are our cousins, not our ancestors. We were both descended from Homo erectus, and that is inarguable. Homo erectus is also much more like your idea of an ape man, but it has now been morphologically and genetically confirmed that man is a subset of apes in the same way that we are a subset of vertebrates or mammals. This is something we can prove conclusively. So asking for an ape man is just as silly as asking for a mammal man or a half-dachshund, half-dog.
Let's summarize. No transitional forms exist anywhere in the fossil record.
Wrong. For decades, they've been finding new transitional species every year. At present, there are hundreds and hundreds of definite transitions, even according to the strictest definition of that word. I made a video listing and explaining many of these and updating a zoological list that already included some 300 transitions, and that list was compiled at the turn of the century. So no, there are numerous transitions throughout the fossil record.
While evolutionists will suggest it took 50 million years for a fish to evolve into an amphibian, the simple truth is there are no transitional fossils to prove it.
Your simple truth is a complete lie. The sequence from Sarcopterygian fish to animals you would recognize as amphibians begins with a line of four-legged, lobed-finned fish like Pandoricthes or Elgenerpeton, pictured here. This is my own rendering, by the way. I sent it to Cambridge professor Jennifer Clack, an expert in Devonian tetrapod evolution. She said the only thing that I got wrong with this is I put it in a marine environment and these were aquatic. So Elgenerpeton hails from 375 million years ago, and this evolutionary sequence continues through Acanthostega, which is my favorite transitional species. It is essentially the Darwin fish. It represents the point where it is neither fish nor a tetrapod, yet both at the same time. Some creationists argue that it's 100% on this side, and some say it's 100% on this other side. And when creationists can't agree and say that it's 100% on both sides at the same time, that's when you know you've got a real transitional species. Tiktaalik looked like this, or a later stage of this, a fish with more amphibian features and even a neck. And Tiktaalik would be on this list too, but this was posted online in 1998, and Tiktaalik wasn't discovered until 2004. See how things change? Anyway, the line moves on to Ichthyostega, which is mostly amphibian and doesn't have any internal gills anymore. But it probably had external gills like baby salamanders do, because its skeleton wasn't yet adapted for dry land, and it still had bone bars in its ray-finned tail. And we'll skip a few and jump over to Simuria. These lived in the Permian about 100 million years after Elgenerpeton. And it still isn't an amphibian because they appear as a sister clade to reptiles, beginning with Selenodonsaurus. This is another transition, but it's more like a half amphibian, half reptile. So you're wrong again. We do have the fossils to prove it.
Grasp this.
Firmly grasp it!
There are no links from plants to animals, reptiles to birds and mammals, etc.
Plants and animals arose separately from a series of protist-like ancestors, so there wouldn't be any links between them. But grasp this. We have lots and lots of transitions between reptiles and birds, and we have so many transitions between what you would call a reptile and mammals that paleontologists and zoologists can't tell when it stops being one and becomes the other. In both lineages, there are so many insensibly fine links, just as Darwin predicted, that they are clearly both. What you have just asserted is demonstrably wrong. This is not a matter of opinion. This is something we can prove.
The fossil record shows that animals appear suddenly.
No, it doesn't. It shows the first animals appearing in the Vendian period, with most phyla subsequently developing in the Cambrian through Ordovician periods, a span of more than 100 million years. And that's just for the phyla. Reptiles, mammals, and amphibians don't appear until another couple 100 million years later. And none of the animals that you showed in your slide existed until a few million years ago, and more than 600 million years after the first animal forms appeared.
They then decided that possibly the fossil record could best be described as indicating macroevolution, sometimes referred to as punctuated equilibrium or the hopeful monster theory. This ludicrous idea suggests a reptile could suddenly lay an egg that would hatch a bird. Of course, since this would be a miracle, it would require God to perform it. But evolutionists can't have that. So evolutionists should probably best be thought of as believing in godless miracles. Now that's a religion worth avoiding. If I sound like I'm mocking them, it's because I am. Any who mock God's existence surely believe we should at least have license to mock them. Their teaching is a disgrace and they embarrass themselves saying they believe it. Don't you believe them?
After all the bewildering inanity that just fell out of your mouth, you think we're embarrassing ourselves? You never have any idea what you're talking about, ever. You're absolutely wrong about absolutely everything. Do you have a word to describe someone who speaks with authority, even when they haven't got the first fucking clue what they're talking about? Here in the South, we call that talking out of your ass. And just to clarify, microevolution is variation within a species. Macroevolution is variation between species. Obviously, it is impossible to tell whether extinct species used to be chemically interfertile. So fossils can't distinguish microevolution. That and macroevolution is also large scale, and the fossil record extends hundreds of millions of years. That's as large scale as it gets. So we're obviously not talking about anything so limited as breeds of dogs being derived in the last few thousand years. It goes much further than that. Macroevolution is never referred to as punctuated equilibrium either. Punc-eq is an evolutionary law or principle proposed by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge in 1972, that natural selection is not always a constant process beyond minimizing the effects of genetic drift, that species may achieve stasis during periods of balance and not experience selective pressures until there's a significant change in the dynamics of their environment. So there's equilibrium, punctuated by occasional changes. The hopeful monster isn't the same as macroevolution or punctuated equilibrium. It's a third, completely different and largely discredited concept proposed by geneticist Richard Goldschmidt back in 1940. He thought that speciation could not occur gradually and that we would need relatively sudden accumulations of coordinated mutations. But speciation has since been observed under both conditions, so this has been demonstrated not to be necessary. What you're talking about, however, is none of the above. You have every definition wrong, and you have them all confused with something else. Your example conveniently omits a couple 100 million years worth of intermediates in the logical fallacy of reductio ad absurdum. Well, that's if you knew anything. Since you obviously don't, then it's the fallacy of incredulity, which has been your staple argument throughout this series.
The light-sensitive cells of the retina are like an extremely complex, high-gain amplifier. There are over 10 million such cells in the retina, and they are packed together with a density of 200,000 per millimeter in the highly sensitive fovea. These photoreceptor cells have a very high rate of metabolism and must completely replace themselves about every 7 days. If you look at a very bright light such as the sun, they immediately burn out, but are rapidly replaced in most cases. Because the retina is thinner than the wavelength of visible light, it is totally transparent.
When it comes to this sort of argument about how difficult it is for humans to duplicate the precision of microscopic components, the primary difference between our perspectives is that you're arguing for an authority dictating design from the top down, where I have to contest you by pointing out that this complexity is actually emergent from the bottom up. That's our basic conflict on a broader scale, too. So when you argue that humans can't build molecular structures as well as atoms can, we can imagine our big old fat fingers trying to put those atoms together. That's kind of like what you're talking about here, too. For example, the film in a camera, back when they used film, was constructed at our macroscopic level, so if you examine it closely enough, it's just a crudely chemically coated sheet. So it couldn't possibly be either as thin or as efficient as a couple 100,000 specialized cells per millimeter. They're so tiny, you can pack an awful lot in, and that membrane would still be thinner than a sandwich bag. Having a high rate of metabolism at the cellular level is normal too, and many cells are replaced much faster than photoreceptive cells. And we should expect that their ability to perform their one function would be enhanced by evolution to optimize for different levels of light. Otherwise, they're largely binary, either firing or not firing. And this is complicated only by whether the receptor is centered or off-center. And some compression of data is necessary because there are only about 1 million axon fibers serving 130 million receptor cells. And tests show that the human retina is not sensitive enough to detect only a single photon, but it's pretty close. However, you were flat wrong when you said that
each of these minute photoreceptor cells is vastly more complex than the most sophisticated man-made computer.
Because the metric you gave to justify that was that
it has been estimated that 10 billion calculations occur every second in the retina before the light image even gets to the brain. It is sobering to compare this performance to the most powerful man-made computer.
you just said that each individual receptor is better than any of our most powerful computers because 10 million of them combined in the entire retina collectively can produce 10 billion calculations per second. Now, why are we calling them calculations? Let's call them operations. That's more accurate. So even if your numbers were correct, the math is still wrong. If there are 10 million photoreceptors in the retina working together to perform 10 billion operations per second, then those cells are only performing 1,000 operations per second each. You think that each individual cell outperforms our most powerful computers? The oldest laptop I have, one from 7 years ago, performs a couple billion operations per second, and now we're up to petaflops. That's not trillions, but quadrillions of operations per second. Remember when I told you how Richard Leakey said that quote mining was the hallmark of creationism's stupidity? Well, your argument is not your argument. All you do is quote other people, and in this case, you're quoting Dr. David Mentum. A paid distortionist with the pseudoscience propaganda mill answers in Genesis. As I pointed out before, they are contractually obliged to misrepresent the data however they need to in order to promote their desired illusion. Dishonest misrepresentation is literally his job. He demonstrates that here, where he wrote a false analysis pretending to dispute data that no one has ever even seen. And that's why the data was deliberately distorted and misrepresented in your earlier claim too. But since he's a creationist, then he doesn't have any of his own studies either. It's becoming a feedback loop because you're quoting someone who is himself quoting someone else.
In very basic form, the eye is thought to have first developed in animals about 550 million years ago. But such is its perfect design, its infinite adaptability, and irreducible complexity that many argue it is proof of the divine itself. In Origin of Species, Darwin remarked that the whole idea of something so flawless could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, he said, absurd in the highest degree.
Yet reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, if further the eye does vary ever so slightly and the variations be inherited, which is certainly the case, and if any variation or modification in the organ be ever useful to the animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable to our imagination, could hardly be considered real. Your mind quotation cut that part out. Darwin continued from there, explaining how the eye is not irreducibly complex. In fact, he showed a sequence of examples reducing its complexity, which also indicate an evolutionary development. In fact, he said, I can see no great difficulty in believing that natural selection has converted the simple apparatus of an optic nerve merely coated with pigment and invested in a transparent membrane into an optical instrument as perfect as is possessed by any member of the great articulate class.
You are left to draw your own conclusions about how such a marvelous organism could have evolved. No wonder my optometrist told me he believes the eye did not evolve. He knew it could not, but rather was invented by the greatest inventor.
Says the guy wearing glasses. Your eye is not an organism. You are an organism. Multicellular organisms have organs made of multiple cells. Individual cells have organelles, which serve essentially the same function, just at a smaller scale. Your optometrist does not know that the eye could not evolve, because we know that it can, because we've shown how it could, and you can't show how it can't. As Darwin said, there should be numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, and then he showed it. The simplest example of that is one even simpler than he knew, a photoreceptive organelle as represented by primitive protists. Even animals that have no brains and no organs, like jellyfish, can still have simple eyes, basically no more than light sensors or light-sensitive pigment cells with a nervous connection. From there we can go a couple of different directions. Complex eyes have evolved according to a half-dozen different patterns. The red cup-like shape at the end of this arm of a starfish is equivalent to a single component of an arthropod's compound eye. So starfish have at least 5 very basic eyes looking in all directions. Horseshoe crabs are arthropods with 2 compound eyes and a half-dozen simpler eyes all over it, including one on its tail. Of course, the more photoreceptor cells that you have, the better your visual acuity. That's why dragonflies have 29,000 lenses on each side, where we have a couple 100,000 photoreceptor cells in the same area of our eyes. Another option is to put the photosensitive pigment cells, or opsins, in a bowl-like depression, as in Lisp planaria, so that you can sense the direction of light. If the bowl is further enclosed, it becomes a pinhole eye like the nautilus, and is even capable of focusing to some degree, even without a lens. In more advanced camera eyes, the opsin becomes a retina, and a lens is formed out of a covering of the eye by transparent proteins appropriated from a previous purpose. The human eye is a marvel of incidental engineering, but it is not the most advanced eye in nature. The eyes of the octopus are actually more advanced than ours because they develop in somewhat reverse order from ours. So the one thing they can't see are the veins in the back of their own eyes, which we sometimes do in bright light. They also don't have the blind spot that we do because their eyes are built more correctly than ours. It is also possible to have the lens fill that cavity rather than covering it, creating the effect of a concave mirror, like the many eyes of this scallop. So we have numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, with slight variations inherited, with each modification being subtle and ever useful. So there is no difficulty in seeing how the eye could have developed naturally through several successive stages, just as Darwin predicted. Now, if you were to show evidence of God, you would have to show first that he exists, and you've given no indication of that. If you ever do, then you'd also have to show that he could actually do anything. And how does he do that? What is the mechanism, and how does it work? So far, you haven't even shown that there is a there. And notice also that no arthropod has the type of eye that vertebrates do, nor vice versa. According to the laws of evolution, every new species can only modify the traits that they've inherited from their ancestors, but a magical creator could do whatever he wants. So some mammals might have feathers, and some insects might have camera eyes, and certainly humans would have better eyes than an octopus, but it's not like that at all. There is every indication that eyes certainly did evolve, and that your God is only imaginary.
I suppose if you're an evolutionist, you would have to believe that at one point in time they formed a committee and decided to all work together. The Mixotricha developing bumps where the spirochetes could burrow their heads and behind which the bacillus could hide, all of whom decided to live in the gut of a termite. Interdependence and ecology are problems for evolutionists. These principles demonstrate there are delicate balances between all of the different species on the earth, and that each is dependent on the other. Which evolved first, a species or the food it feeds upon?
In this case, the food evolved first, but it can be the other way around, because species that are adaptable can become capable of something else and change habits accordingly. Understand that evolution is an explanation of biodiversity. In fact, it is the only explanation of how one species proliferates into many. For example, Bacillus is a genus of rod-shaped bacteria consisting of several different species found all over the world, one of which is responsible for anthrax. How's that for intelligent design? Likewise, there are a half dozen different genus of spirochetes, each having multiple species, with one of them responsible for Lyme disease. Glory to God for creating them, right? And you may have thought that you were talking about the Australian termite, but it turns out there are roughly 300 species of termite just in Australia. Only one of them has the symbiotes you're talking about, which is why that one is named after Charles Darwin. I know you don't understand why that is. You don't understand anything, and you probably still won't even after I explain it, but here goes. Termites are six-legged insects closely related to cockroaches and earwigs. All animals, including you, have symbiotic bacteria living in their gut to assist with digestion. You are a symbiotic organism. Every one of your cells is infested with a disabled rickettsia bacteria whose ancestors lost the ability to escape the infested cell. Thus, sequestered mitochondria have become domesticated by the host cell and now live in symbiosis with it by providing additional fuel in exchange for its own nourishment. This wasn't an agreed arrangement. Spirochetes don't have heads. They aren't thinking creatures and they can't communicate. Neither were they poofed out of nothing by magic. This is just microbial biochemistry. It occasionally works out this way, but most often doesn't. Fully functional rickettsia causes rickets. You might want to praise God for that too. Different organisms have ingested different bacteria. Sometimes it passes harmlessly, sometimes there's an adverse effect, but sometimes there's a mutual benefit. So early termites ingested not just bacteria to help digest plant cellulose, they also ingested a species of protozoans, single-celled eukaryotes that do the same thing. How termites acquired those protists is no great mystery either. Earwigs and cockroaches try to eat anything anyway, including wood, and that's how termite ancestors acquired these symbiotes, more or less infecting each other, but in a way that leads to mutual benefit. Otherwise, they never could have achieved this recurrent state. So what you have is some ancient bug trying to eat wood, and it accidentally eats protists on the wood that also eat wood. And since the bug is cold-blooded, there's nothing to kill the protist and no reason to, since it doesn't harm the bug. And a couple extra germs attached to the protist because germs are everywhere, and in this case the bug's gut is consistently serving what all three of them happen to eat. So there's no mystery as to how all this came about sequentially and obviously not all at the same time.
Could the dolphin acquire these features gradually, one at a time, over millions of years?
Duh and or hello.
What about the transitional stages? Would they have survived with just some of these features?
Well, obviously.
Every intermediate has proved to be, just as predicted, easily capable as it is. An important aspect of biodiversity is that many species start out generalized, like a jack of all trades. They can get by in many different environments if they have to, but they're not really adept at any of them. Then when they specialize, they can make vast improvements in something they could already do and keep getting better at it. But it comes at a cost, as they have to give up the versatility they used to have.
For me, it takes a great stretch of the imagination to picture the evolution of dolphins and whales. End of quote.
I guess Douglas B. Sharp should change his name then. One good way to illustrate whale evolution is to see it reflected in embryology. I'm not saying that ontogeny necessarily recapitulates phylogeny, we know better than that, but there is a branch of biology called evo-devo, where embryological development mirrors certain aspects of evolutionary development. For example, in this dolphin, you can see that the nostrils first appear on the tip of the snout and then move to the top of the head, the same way that it evolved. Likewise, this whale embryo has hind flippers just like they used to, but these are reabsorbed as it develops, just like it evolved. And all this, again, would only be true if evolution is true. And none of this would be this way for anything that was magically created unrelated to anything else. Not unless your God is a trickster making up evidence of something else intent on fooling people.
The anglerfish, archerfish, and anableps all literally swim in the face of evolution. The female angler has a lure hanging from an appendage on her nose. It attracts fish so she can strike and swallow them. The male does not have one because he never eats. Rather, he attaches himself to the female, allowing their bloodstreams to merge, thus feeding him. Evolutionists have no explanation for anglerfish.
Yes, we do, of course. This article talks about how an international team of marine biologists used genomic sequence analysis to trace the evolution of hundreds of separate species of anglerfish within dozens of different genera emerging from 18 taxonomic families within 5 phylogenetic suborders. Using molecular clock Bayesian analysis of the divergence times indicates that subordinal diversifications within a particular parental lineage all occurred within a relatively short time period between 100 and 130 million years ago in the early to mid-Cretaceous. Phylogenetic data constructed a series of cladograms for each of the subgroups, tested alternate hypotheses, and even specifically addressed the relatively few species wherein the male becomes a morbidly absorbed parasite of the female and ceases to exist as anything more than an otherwise digested sack of sperm. Don't you ever get tired of being wrong about everything all the time?
The anableps has extraordinary eyes. It sits on the surface, seeing out of water and underwater at the same time. Its eyes are divided into two parts. How did evolution cause half an eye to gradually evolve to see out of water and the other half underwater?
A moment on Google would have shown you a number of studies that answer this. Anableps share this fortuitous deformity with two other closely related species within a single genus. Their genes were compared to another unaffected but closely related species from a sister genus. All of these from an obviously evolutionary relationship. How they evolved is pretty obvious just from the morphology. The lens is distorted above and below, and the only subsequent enhancement of that is an asymmetrical arrangement of the opsins in the retina.
It was a shock to people of the 19th century when they discovered, from observations science had made, that many features of the biological world could be ascribed to natural selection. It is a shock to us in the 20th century to discover, from observations science has made, that the fundamental mechanisms of life cannot be ascribed to natural selection and therefore were designed. But we must deal with our shock as best we can and go on. The theory of undirected evolution is already dead, but the work of science continues. End of quote.
This is another bald-faced lie. Upon publication of Darwin's definitive work a century and a half ago, creationism died an abrupt death right then, and evolution has only become better and better supported ever after. Creationism has been scientifically dead since the horse and buggy days, and that's not going to change.
Remember, true science always harmonizes with the facts, all of them. Believers in God or creation need never fear the facts of science.
No honest person need fear the facts of science. If you want to understand what is really true, then of course you would want to know where you're wrong about what and how so that you can correct it, and you would thank whoever corrected you. But if belief in God is more important to you than knowing what is really real, then yeah, you're going to be afraid of science, and you'll likely fear many other truths too.
Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that some spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, one that is vastly superior to that of man. In this way, the pursuit of science leads to a religious feeling of a special sort, he said.
Einstein also said, "It was of course a lie what you read about my religious convictions, a lie which is being systematically repeated." I do not believe in a personal God and have never denied this, but have expressed it clearly. If something is in me which can be called religious, then it is the unbounded admiration for the structure of the world so far as our science can reveal it. I have never talked to a Jesuit priest in my life, and I'm astonished by the audacity to tell such lies about me. From the viewpoint of a Jesuit priest, I am, of course, and always have been, an atheist. I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of the world, not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind. For me, the Jewish religion, like all others, is an incarnation of the most childish superstitions. The word God is for me nothing more than the expression and product of human weakness. The Bible, a collection of honorable but still primitive legends which are nevertheless pretty childish. No interpretation, no matter how subtle, can, for me, change this.
Of course, again, honest theologians would never deny science.
Perhaps they don't, but you do. For example, you said there were no transitional species, and you said that the fossil record doesn't even exist.
Evolution is based entirely on faith, because no true facts or proof have ever been found to support it.
That is a lie. Rather than admit that scientists follow evidence, you lied again, saying that they're the ones using deception for unrealistic or religious reasons. No, sir, that's you. You don't even take your own advice.
Remember, assumptions don't count. Neither do superstitious myths or traditions based on ignorance.
This is you talking. You yourself said,
What can be known from science? Only accept facts, think rationally and clearly, then accept what can be proven.
but you don't. Your denial of science reveals that you are clearly not an honest theologian. You are a liar and a charlatan.
Now let's take an imaginary trip to the moon and look back at Earth. Consider all we left behind. Let's ask, what are the mathematical odds that the Earth, with all its plants, animals, ecosystems, and complex interdependence, could come into existence by itself? What are the actual odds all this could happen, that even one Earth could occur?
What a surprise. Who would have thought that you would refer not to fact, observation, or experience, but rather
unreasonable extrapolations from abstract probabilities, mathematics, and philosophy.
what a hypocrite.
Powerful music sometimes stirs emotions to glorious heights of association with supposed truth. Compelling language is used and scripting of outcome to sell nonsensical drivel. Poetic rhythm is often employed, with utter gibberish repeated over and over until the viewer or reader has almost no choice but to collapse and accept pure fiction as fact. Foolish comparisons are sprinkled throughout. Marvelous visible wonders are connected to opinions.
None of this applies to evolutionary science. Our truth is not supposed, it's verifiable. Truth is whatever can be shown to be true. What I say is truth, I can show to be true. What you say is truth, I can show to be false. Otherwise, it's only empty, indefensible assertions, at best, literally gibberish with poetic rhythm, all designed to make people believe what is really pure fiction, without any truth to it at all.
Powerful graphics are shown, but also based on complete fiction, like bone fragments being presented as part of the evolutionary fossil record when no such record exists.
You just said that the total number of fossils that have ever been discovered were never discovered, that they do not exist. So do you think that every fossil ever found have all been fraudulent? What about the tens of thousands of paleontologists working around the world today? Are they merely craftsmen making handmade forgeries? Would this include Georges Cuvier, the father of paleontology, who lived in the 1700s? He was a Christian anatomist who identified the fossils brought to him by several different people from numerous quarries. So how could he have faked those? Does it matter if they're Christian? Because Dr. Robert T. Bacher may be an important paleontologist with 2 Ivy League science degrees, but he is also a Pentecostal preacher. What motive would he have for faking fossils? And how would he do that when he's on a dig with all of these other people? Does he go there the night before and bury everything, expecting them to find it? I guess what you're suggesting must be a massive, globally cohesive conspiracy spanning over 300 years without any leaks, regardless of the different religious convictions of anyone involved. That's amazing. Especially when you consider that it is all for absolutely no reason at all, except perhaps to disprove a collection of fables that have already been disproved. I've been to all the best natural history museums in Los Angeles, Houston, New York, London, and the Dallas Museum and the Perot Museum. And you're saying that all of those displays in all of those places are fake? When I recently toured the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, the director gave me a private tour of their labs and fossil stores. They have some amazing stuff back there, most of which they're still trying to extract from the surrounding rock, but I guess you think they're just sculpting them, right? When I was a paleo student myself, my professor gave me this trilobite from the Paleozoic era. It was in a drawer full of similar fossils, most of which is still partially embedded in sedimentary rock, but I guess you think this is just handmade jewelry. What about this ammonite? Or this one? If you can see them up close, you can tell that they're different species. These are both Cretaceous ammonites. They're quite a bit different than the orthocones that you get from the Paleozoic. I dug these out of the ground myself on a fossil dig as part of a class trip, and then, of course, I wrote a paper about it as was required. Do you expect me or anyone to believe that these fossils I'm holding in my hand, or these fossils, don't even exist? Because that forces me to ask a difficult question. Are you mentally incompetent, willfully ignorant, or deliberately dishonest? And I'm going with 2 out of 3, because I see that you've amassed quite a cult under your control, a multi-million-dollar racket. So you're obviously not mentally incompetent necessarily, maybe not completely, but you are willfully ignorant without excuse, and you've shown that you are deliberately dishonest as well. In other words, you are a liar. There is a fossil record, and there's no way, even as ignorant as you are, that you don't know that.
Have scientists known sin? Of course. We have misused science, just as we have every other tool at our disposal. The leap of logic begins here, and that's why we can't afford to leave it in the hands of a powerful few, unless they're scientists.
Duh. Science should be in the hands of scientists, just like shoemaking should be in the hands of cobblers. Trained pilots should be the ones flying the planes, and only doctors should practice medicine. There is no sense turning science over to someone like you who doesn't know what it is or how to do it.
The more science belongs to all of us, the less likely it is to be misused, meaning by religionists.
No, wrong again. There he was talking about totalitarians. You couldn't misuse science because you'd have to know how to use it first. It's a way of stripping away what isn't true to find out what is. That's a game you won't play. You've obviously never read any scientific articles or journals. You've had no education in the subject whatsoever. All you know about science is what you read in popular magazines at the doctor's office, or one episode of a TV series that you probably didn't even watch.
Tracing that long path by which it arrived at consciousness, we and the other living things on this planet carry a legacy of cosmic evolution spanning billions of years. If we come to know and love nature as it really is, then we will surely be remembered by our descendants as good, strong links in the chain of life. Obviously very sincere, but just as sincerely wrong.
No, you asshole. Carl Sagan is one of the most venerated astrophysicists, cosmologists. He's literally a rocket scientist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning science communicator, and a brilliant man. He also happens to be right, because what he said is verifiably correct, while everything you said is bewilderingly inane. All you've done is compile lies upon lies, professing to be wise, but ye are a fool. The only thing I find impressive about your presentation is how anyone can be so consistently proven to be absolutely wrong about absolutely everything 100% of the time for such a long time and still believe yours is the absolute truth. It's not. None of it. You're wrong. There is no God. And the way I know this is because if there was, he would have slapped some sense into you by now.
And the more mankind learns about how the human body functions, we must ask, how could it possibly have just evolved? The very nose on your face brings this question smashing into it.
The evolutionary answer is as plain as the nose on your face. I do know the answer to your question, but it's a longer answer than all of your questions combined. Part of that concerns your nose. We have all the defining characteristics of monkeys: fingerprints, fingernails, enlarged brains, 2 pectoral mammae, even for males, another indicator of unintelligent design. But even those ears of yours, every monkey has ears like that, and only monkeys have ears like that. But your nose determines which kind of monkey you are. Platyrrhines, or New World monkeys, generally have nostrils that are splayed apart out to the sides. But catarrhines, Old World monkeys, have their nostrils pointing down. I think we're the only animals on Earth whose nostrils point downward like that, and maybe that's because, being monkeys, the things that we smell are either in or on our fingers.
It is in the same sense of scientific honesty that I endorse the presentation of alternative theories for the origin of the universe, life, and man in the science classroom.
But remember that a scientific theory is a field of study and a body of knowledge, including all the known facts, natural laws, and potential hypotheses related to that topic. But there is none of that for God. There is literally nothing anyone can honestly say they actually know about God, including whether there is such a thing or even could be.
It would be an error to overlook the possibility that the universe was planned rather than happening by chance. End of quote.
I would not overlook any possibility, but once again, I repeat, you have to show that there is one. You have to show that there is some means by which a mind could exist independent of the brain that created it, which is already impossible by definition, to say nothing of existing both within the universe and not within it, but beyond it, as you allege. Failing that, you should at least show some mechanism by which it could function, some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon confirming that such possibility even exists. But you don't have that for God. You ain't got shit for God, just a handful of myths that we know aren't true, and the wishful thinking of woolly minds who refuse to admit that they're not true.
In fact, most scientists do not want you reading these kinds of other scientists.
Because we would prefer that scientists be remembered respectfully for their contributions and not for their embarrassing foibles. In an attempt to save von Braun's reputation here, you could at least have included another citation from the same book you were just quoting, wherein Wernher von Braun says he does not believe in creation, but in a loftier, more deistic concept of God, one which he at least thought that he had shared with other scientific pioneers back when scientists still commonly held such beliefs. But the trend is that the more educated we are, the less religious we are. Although religion in general is in a state of decline in every Western demographic, excluding immigration, religious beliefs among scientists are much rarer, much quieter, and when they exist, they are much more advanced in concept than anything you believe.
A number of recent books and articles would have you believe that somehow science has now disproved the existence of God.
No scientist ever said they've disproved God, but then neither would they ever need to. And not just because it can be logically impossible to disprove a negative. But that's why the burden of proof is always on the one making the positive claim. Your God is an extraordinary claim, asserted without any evidence at all, and against all evidence to the contrary. It's not just an unsubstantiated and thus empty assertion, it's dishonest as well. There is no need to disprove what was never indicated in the first place, especially when such is not even possible. That's why things that are asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. That means we don't have to prove that God does not exist. You have to prove that he does. And so far, your attempt has been what we call a faceplant.
Biological evolution has not brought us the slightest understanding of how the first living organisms emerged from inanimate matter on this planet and how the advanced eukaryotic cells, the highly structured building blocks of advanced life forms, ever emerged from simpler organisms.
Because 1, that's not evolution, that's abiogenesis. 2, DNA didn't come from simpler organisms because it isn't limited just to advanced life forms. DNA is a requirement of all life forms. Some viruses have it too, and they're not even alive, so they're not organisms at all. 3, the first living organisms actually arose from animate matter, as I explained in an earlier episode, where I also explained how experimental science shows how inanimate matter can become animate.
Neither does it explain one of the greatest mysteries of science. How did consciousness arise in living things?
Yes, it does, actually.
What is it that allows humans to understand the mysteries of biology, physics, mathematics, engineering, and medicine? And what enables us to create great works of art, music, architecture, and literature?
We know how natural selection can establish motor sensory connections and hone these from what starts as a simple nerve knot and ends up as millions of synaptic connections. We know also how hunting and other activities can increase intelligence and how social hunters necessarily develop greater group coordination and communication. Such animals not only demonstrate problem-solving skills, but they typically have some level of awareness of self as well as empathy for others. If you're lucky enough to be a social species committed to coordinated collaboration and communication, then it's just a combination of excess brain mass and the luxury to employ it, which develops from there to increase cognizance to concepts. That's where dolphins are. They would be where we are if they had hands and could experiment with chemical reactions. Talk about an unintelligent design. Once a system becomes self-improving, capable of learning, and given sufficient hardware to manage and explore it, consciousness is easily achieved, and conceptual analysis is eventually possible, even from blind design subjected to the dynamics of population mechanics. This is a super abbreviated summary, of course. Suffice it to say that science has explained the emergence of consciousness and is the only thing that can explain that.
Why is our universe so precisely tailor-made for the emergence of life? This question has never been answered satisfactorily.
Maybe the answer isn't satisfactory to someone who won't accept any answer other than God. Someone who desperately needs to pretend that they have a special purpose and will live forever and that they are the reason the universe exists and that to believe otherwise is somehow arrogant. But that question has been answered, and the answer is that the universe is obviously not fine-tuned for the development of life on Earth. The universe is what? 78 billion light years across in every direction, with trillions of galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of planets that won't support life, and the occasional inhabited island is really just a life raft adrift in an otherwise inhospitable void of poisonous, boiling chaos that would kill us instantly everywhere else. But you want to pretend that this breathless, deadly abyss of flaming radioactive projectiles was created just for us?
Why did everything we need to exist come into being? How was all of this possible without some latent outside power to orchestrate the precise dance of elementary particles required for the creation of all the essentials of life?
How would that be possible with God? How could your God manipulate matter? How does he control when someone loses their car keys or gets a new job or wins the big game? How could he know the future if everyone's supposed to have free will to do what is not expected? How did he create life? How does he do anything? How could he even exist? How could we apes be made in his image unless he is an invisible ape? Gods and magic are not explanations of anything. They're excuses for not knowing and not wanting to.
Atheism and evolution are religions to vast millions, something they consider to be personal, matters of faith not to be contested.
Atheism and evolution are religions to exactly no one, anywhere, ever. And neither one has anything to do with faith either, nor are they personal, as both are based on objective principles of rational intellectual honesty rather than faith. Evolution is a scientific study of population genetics and biodiversity over time, one which is traceable, demonstrable, and measurable by experts of many different religions as well as those of no religion. Because while there are religions that could be called atheists, like some forms of Buddhism or pantheism, because those religions might not include gods, the word atheism means without theism, without religion. So a lack of religion is not a religion, and a lack of faith is not faith. You are a liar, Mr. Pack, and unlike you, we are not afraid of having our beliefs contested either.
Let's see why so many atheists and evolutionists live in a world of frustration and disillusionment. It reveals a great truth.
You don't know what truth is. You have no familiarity with it and will not use it. Instead, you lie about us. I don't know any atheists such as you describe, unless the frustration you speak of is that we live in a world ruled by leaders who are no more honest, competent, educated, or ethical than you. Otherwise, we are much better off than believers on several statistical metrics. I've always been happier than you'll ever be. So you shouldn't talk about the frustration and disillusionment of atheists because, remember, as I said in the last video, I've heard from the people in your cult. I know better.
They worked your ass off, you know. There was no standing around. David C. Pack, David Pack, the pastor general of the church, if he saw, he hated seeing people walking slow. He made it a point to, scare the church members into that you should be walking fast all the time and, with fear and, get the work done, to get God's work done. So there was a lot of that bullshit and keep them tired, keep them so they don't ask questions or don't think, because that's what a cult does. They keep you so busy, they keep you so in fear that you don't think for yourself and don't ask questions. The authoritative abuse, more like spiritual abuse from the higher-ups, because they're always looking, they're always using fear that the end is coming, that the apocalypse or whatever is coming, Armageddon, all this shit, to scare you, to get your money, to get you into obedience, to get you to do things for them. It's just an abusive relationship. There was dating restrictions. I couldn't date anyone outside of my race. I couldn't even dance with someone outside of my race. They regulated your hair length. Men couldn't have his hair past the ears, I think. And I'm thinking to myself at the time when I'm out there, I'm like, I want to be almost anywhere else than here. This is not what I wanted. So I just took all my stuff one morning and just packed my car, whatever I could, and just left. I left a few things there, but I could give two shits about that because I'm gone and it's over and I'm happier. So today I'm an agnostic. a very much happier agnostic than I was as a theist in a cult. And
So, Mr. Pack of Lies, you dare say that we're the ones who are frustrated and disillusioned? You'd better get that plank out of your eye, you hypocrite.
A brief inset. While a subject for another time, at least realize the universe and Earth are not 6,000 years old as some claim.
Well, look at that. We agree on something.
This comes from misunderstanding the Genesis account, which leads many to lose confidence in the arguments of creationists.
No, the reason people have no confidence in the arguments of creationists is that they're all baseless assertions of frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies devoid of any actual factual data indicative of your assumptions. And you believe impossible nonsense for no good reason. It's hard for people to believe in you when they see that you're just making shit up and that you never have any idea what you're talking about and are always wrong on every point all the time, especially in your case, lacking any sort of charismatic charm, being so obviously ignorant, bigoted, irrational, delusional, dishonest, and reportedly abusive to however few are weaker than you.
Genesis 1:1 describes God creating the entire universe. Satan's rebellion occurred at some point between verses 1 and 2.
Whoa! Talk about reading between the lines. You've somehow shoved the entirety of geologic history between two connected sentences, such that 4 billion years had passed before there was even a second day, just to pretend that the Bible says something that it obviously doesn't say.
Because they had failed to overthrow their creator, the devil and his demons, like spoiled children who could not get their own way, wrecked the face of the earth. Earthquakes and volcanoes shattered the planet, causing geological mayhem. Poisonous gases filled the atmosphere, choking everything that breathed and shutting out sunlight. Oceans overflowed Earth's surface until the whole planet was covered with water. All life, dinosaurs, plants, insects, and other creatures, was destroyed.
And according to you, all of this happened before God raised the land above the water, before he separated the waters above the firmament from the sky beneath it, before he created plants and animals, before there was light, and before God created the sun. All of which proves that your interpretation cannot be correct, because paleobiology proves that there was already dry land and light and stable weather for a habitable environment. This is why religion doesn't allow believers to question anything, isn't it? Some years ago, I made a video called An Archaeological Moment in Time, which explains what the different societies around the globe already look like in the day that you imagine the earth was created. I know you don't ever talk to scientists, but if you ask archaeologists about their studies of any of the currently inhabited parts of the world, you'll learn that there were diverse cultures with different languages already dispersed all over the world many thousands of years before you think the world of men was even created.
But Earth has existed for billions of years.
Right, and according to you and your misunderstanding of Bronze Age mythology, the Earth was inhabited by demons all that time. However, reality indicates something else, reversing your sequence of events, such that the tumultuous period of poisonous gases and all that came at the beginning, followed by a stabilization and proliferation of increasingly complex ecosystems. Scientific evidence shows that the Earth was only inhabited by microbes for the first 80% of the history of life on this planet. Once eukaryotes were derived, largely by endosymbiosis, they began a proliferation into protists and then the first molds, plants, and animals, all occurring at different times. And importantly, there is no division whatever between what you describe as two vastly different time periods. Modern humans emerged among a few remaining prehistoric monsters. And when men built their first cities thousands of years before you think the world began, there were many more species than there are today. And when you think our world was created, mankind was already ancient, and woolly mammoths were still around.
World-famous astronomist Carl Sagan came to believe God exists, that no other explanation for the universe was possible.
Bullshit. You are such a liar. First of all, Carl Sagan was an astronomer, not an astronomist. Astronomy is not a religious belief. Second, Sagan was always very clear about the ability of science to provide natural explanation for the origin of the universe. He also understood the fact that gods were born out of ignorance and are such a silly idea as to be unworthy of serious consideration.
What's your personal opinion? You know, put you on the spot a little bit.
I'm a scientist, so I say I go where the evidence goes, not what I personally would like
what
to.
Is the evidence as you interpret it?
I would love to believe.
Your theory.
I would love to believe that there was a God who made us, who's looking out for us.
And loves us.
Loves us.
We need
takes
love.
care of us. And
makes us intelligent, guides us and keeps us.
Such a mess. We're doing things so wrong. Then we would be relieved of the responsibility of taking care of ourselves.
The voice would come from up above and say,
don't pollute the atmosphere, stop the chlorofluorocarbons. Right.
Weapons.
That's right. But that does not seem to be the case.
We have to solve our own problems.
We have to solve our own problems.
A fascinating quote from his book, Pale Blue Dot, written after seeing a picture of Earth taken from Voyager 1, 4 billion miles away, brings powerful perspective to objective thinkers.
But all of that is apparently lost on subjective wanna-believers like you.
That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, you know, you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hero and coward, creator and destroyer of civilization, king and peasant, every young couple in love, mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, corrupt politician, superstar, supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. Yet the greatest help any could imagine is coming and is just over the horizon.
No, you're fantasizing again, asserting baseless speculations as if it were a matter of fact. In other words, you're lying. And you're ignoring what Carl Sagan just said, because that proves you're lying again. You just recited where Carl Sagan said,
in our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves.
Having no hint of God means there is nothing to convince any thinking person that there is a God. And Sagan, unlike you, was a thinker, not a pretender.
Humbled by facts and reality, Carl Sagan knew God existed.
You are so full of shit. What could you know about facts, or reality, or humility for that matter, since those who know you say that you think you are personally mentioned in the Bible? It's one thing to assert something as fact when it is not a fact. That's already a lie. But it's a lower level of dishonesty to state things as true that are not only not known to be true, but are known to be not true. And even you know are absolute bullshit. You have no justification or defense for such dishonest deceit.
All should ponder his words.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that.
If the general picture, however, of a Big Bang followed by an expanding universe is correct, what happened before that? Was the universe devoid of all matter, and then the matter suddenly, somehow created? How did that happen? In many cultures, the customary answer is that a god or gods created the universe out of nothing. But if we wish to pursue this question courageously, we must, of course, ask the next question. Where did God come from? If we decide that this is an unanswerable question, why not save a step and conclude that the origin of the universe is an unanswerable question? Or, if we we say that God always existed, why not save a step and conclude that the universe always existed, that there's no need for a creation, it was always here? These are not easy questions. Cosmology brings us face to face with the deepest mysteries, with questions that were once treated only in religion and myth.
There you have it. Proof that Carl Sagan did not believe in any God, you lying sack of shit.
For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. I warned it was strong.
You lied. That was so weak. The passage you're citing referred only to a specific group of people at one particular time and has no relevance at all today, other than a comment on how different people's religious beliefs change and grow apart over time. None of those people knew God either.
Modern science is without excuse when it chooses to believe evolution and chooses to ignore God's existence.
We do not choose to believe what we can prove to be true, nor do we ignore what does not even exist or that we can prove to be false. Sane people have no choice but to accept reality as it is, as we can prove it to be. That's why religious beliefs match the definitions that psychiatrists give for a psychotic delusion.
You've heard, there is none so blind as he who refuses to see.
Yes, and you're giving a demonstration of that.
If people refuse truth, evidence, clear proof of God's existence, it is willful blindness.
You're giving a demonstration of that sort of willful blindness too, but of course you haven't provided any proof of your magic imaginary friend. Nothing that would qualify as evidence, and nothing you've said has been truth either. Your 5-part series has been nothing but a couple of hours of logical fallacies, willful ignorance, bewildering inanity, and continuous lies. Would that I could demonstrate that in a live debate with your ignorant ass. One where your deluded sheep could watch and see you fail to such degree that just their embarrassment for and of you would be enough to cure them of your influence. But, of course, we both already know why you would never allow that to happen.
Remember, God states, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God.
That too is a lie, because a fool is properly defined as one who too readily believes improbable nonsense from questionable sources on insufficient evidence. Whoa, is that you? So it's no surprise that both the Bible and the Quran give the exact opposite definition than the dictionary does, because they don't want religious believers to know they've been fooled.
There is no proof, evidence, fact, logic, or sound reasoning that could ever cause anyone who is unwilling to set aside their natural prejudice against believing in and yielding to the authority of a loving God to accept that authority.
But that's not the situation here. You're projecting again, describing yourself in violation of your own 9th commandment. The people you're falsely accusing are not at all like you, in that we have set aside our prejudice and seek to minimize, if not eliminate, our biases and respect only evident facts as proof in accordance with sound logical reasoning, whereas you have rejected all these things in favor of an unwarranted assertion based on an indefensible faith in an imagined authority.
We humans long to be connected with our origins, so we create rituals. Science is another way to express this longing. It also connects us with our origins, and it too has its rituals and its commandments. Its only sacred truth is that there are no sacred truths.
Temperature systems.
All assumptions must be critically examined. Arguments from authority are worthless.
Mode is imaging free. AACS readout mode is telemetry. Transducer power is on.
Whatever is inconsistent with the facts
no matter how fond of it we are, must be discarded or revised.
So you lied about Carl Sagan. You lied about all of us. You lied about science. You lied about your religion. And you even lied about yourself. And you blame reasonable people for not believing you and say we are unwise not to? No, man. Wise men should know better than to believe someone like you.
Know you it? Because you were then born? Or because the number of your days is great?
This is just another version of Ken Ham's tedious and credulous question.
Were you there? Next time you hear on television somebody say millions of years ago, what's the question we're going to ask them? Were you there? Were you there? Call them up on the telephone and say, excuse me, Mr. TV man, were you there? Let's say it again. Were you? Only way we could know what happened in the past if someone was there to tell us. That's right, dinosaurs lived beside people. And of course you'll have an evolutionist who'll say, that's not right, dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. What do you ask them? Were you there?
Have you entered into the treasures of the snow? Or have you seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war?
Here God is asking whether we know where he stores his snow and where he draws his hail from. That must have been a perplexing question back before people had ice boxes or knew how to freeze things.
By what way is the light parted, which scatters the east wind upon the earth?
There is no east wind. The light doesn't move the wind, and the light doesn't have to be parted either, because the sun is so much bigger than the earth. And of course, the biblical authors didn't know that. They thought that the sun was smaller than the earth and that it could be stopped in the sky, and that the sun and the moon were the same size and all that. The light does reflect an awful lot, but if the biblical authors knew that, then they wouldn't have said that the moon was a light. They probably shouldn't have said that the moon was bigger than all of the stars, too. Maybe they should have known that the sun was just one of the stars, but you know what? These are just ignorant, primitive, superstitious savages who have no idea what they're talking about.
Who has put wisdom in the inward parts, or who has given understanding to the human heart?
No one put wisdom into the inward parts. Wisdom is acquired through learning and experience. The heart isn't the organ that understands things, but the mere fallible man who wrote the Bible didn't even know that.
Strangely, they seem willing to read a mystery book, knowing in advance the mystery will not be solved.
Mysteries are typically solved at the end of the book, but the more you read the Bible, the worse it gets. And the more you study its origins and comparative religion, the harder it is to believe. The more you study humanity, history, culture, science, especially archaeology and anthropology, the more obvious it is that man created gods in his own image. There, I solved your mystery.
Billions have asked who and what is God. This central question has confounded man for millennia. He has still not found the answer.
I just told you. It's an imaginary friend, a creature of the id, a figment of your imagination, made up to explain things you don't understand so that you'll stop looking for the real answers. It's a means of manipulation of the masses with the stick and the carrot of false promises and empty threats. It's also so that you can pretend that you won't really die or that you have powerful connections at the top who can even reorder reality if that's what you need to believe. A psychological crutch. That's what your God is.
For those who believe God authored the Bible, Christians, the question comes into sharper focus. Who and what is the God of the Bible?
Oh, I know. He's the most unpleasant character in all fiction. He's jealous and proud of it. He's a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Think. If one knew and were worshiping the true God, he would automatically be led into all the right knowledge offered by that God, revealed only to those who have a relationship with Him.
Then you yourself should be proof enough that you're not worshiping a true God.
The true God would not leave one in ignorance about how He was to be worshiped.
Any God worthy of worship would not want to be worshiped.
Set aside all personal bias and see if God is revealing himself to you. Let's ask, what is the ultimate difference between the God of the Bible and every other God?
Yours is Jewish. So I guess your God is circumcised because he couldn't even make a wiener the way he wanted. So he tells his people to correct his mistake and cut up their son's most sensitive organ without anesthetic, despite unnecessary risks, and for no good reason. That's the difference.
How does he differentiate himself from all others?
The same way all the other gods do. He brags a lot. Haven't you noticed that the way all the gods sing their own praises, they sound like the MCs of hip-hop?
Having now proven God exists, are you worshiping the true God, the God who is alive, or something non-existent and dead, a God who is not? This question towers over all others before you.
Before I can answer that question, I have to point out that you've been proven wrong on every allegation you've made throughout this series, and you have yet to provide evidence or reason of any kind to believe there even is a God at all, much less yours. But if your God did exist, I still wouldn't worship it. If it were the Bible God, it wouldn't deserve it. And if he did deserve it, he wouldn't want it. A God who is truly worthy of that level of admiration wouldn't even care if I believed in it. It certainly wouldn't require that I believe in it on faith. And if it was a just, or righteous, or wise God, then he wouldn't want me to believe you either.
They could no longer hide behind atheism or agnosticism. They would be without excuse if they chose not to pursue why they were born.
It is not even possible to hide behind atheism. That doesn't make any sense either. And besides, I'm not the one who is hiding. I don't have a required conclusion like you do, so I don't fear truth like you do. I'm the one who chose to pursue this where you have not, because you won't follow the evidence wherever it leads. You are pretending, and consequently you are obviously the one hiding from the truth.
At some point, most people wonder why they are here. What's the purpose of human life? Yet, like Carl Sagan, they live and die never knowing the truth, or even that they could have known.
Blind, baseless speculation is not truth. Truth is whatever is concordant with reality, and that eliminates everything in the Bible. Sagan limited himself only to truth, to things he could show that he actually knows, where you have chosen to avoid truth, holding instead to empty assertions of irrational, unsupported, and impossible, contradictory, foolish nonsense, and pretending to know what no one even can know. If you did know it, there would be some way to demonstrate that knowledge, so that we wouldn't be expected to believe you just because you said so, and we wouldn't have to gullibly believe your farcical fables either. Remember what Sagan said. In science, the only sacred truth is there are no sacred truths. Arguments from authority are worthless. Whatever is inconsistent with the facts, no matter how fond of it we are, must be discarded or revised. That eliminates the entirety of your belief system, because nothing you say or believe counts as truth.
This is revealed knowledge, unattainable to all whom God has not called to learn his truth.
Then it's not revealed knowledge, it's secret knowledge. Except that it's not knowledge either, since it can't be demonstrated. That's also why it isn't truth, since it can't be confirmed. Nor does that matter, because you're saying it doesn't matter what we study or how much we know, because God decides who he's going to infect with the confusion of your delusion, and any prior knowledge is therefore meaningless. You've also admitted that it's not possible to discover this otherwise through objective study. So it isn't the investigative expert scholars who are ignoring things, you are. Your entire belief system and your empire of oppression are all built on lies, things even you know are false. You and your ilk are the ones trying to deceive the world, but you can't fool them all. Your cult is coming down because your sheep aren't all as stupid as you are, and they're starting to figure you out.
Realize that disproving evolution automatically proves God's existence.
No, it doesn't, stupid. And disproving creationism wouldn't prove evolution either. Both of these options and any other possibilities need to be evidenced individually. It's not enough to show that another answer is wrong. You also have to show that your answer is right. Because what if the universe is the equivalent of a computer-constructed matrix wherein the program requires that every solar system like ours must have at least one inhabited planet? That's not any more ridiculous than imagining an infinitely old and isolated genie who sat around for an eternity before he decided to conjure reality with an incantation spell. What if extinctions and biodiversity are governed at the cellular level by competing patterns of intelligence hidden in the DNA? A version of this idea was even recently proposed at the Royal Society of Scientists in London. So how do you show evidence of either of these ideas? You can't just disprove the one that is supported and replace that with one you know isn't supported, especially when we already know that that can't be true. You have to show that your idea has merit too, and it doesn't. You're simply combining logical fallacies, starting with your sentence, which is a non sequitur, and then you use your staple arguments from ignorance and personal incredulity. You don't understand science, so it can't be true. Followed by question begging, the logical fallacy of the circular argument routing back to the assumed conclusion, which in your case is also the fallacy of questionable cause, also known as the false cause or confusing cause and effect. This combination of fallacies is known informally by another name, the God of the gaps, where you think that anything that is unexplained is explained by God. Understand that according to the National Academy of Science, it is no longer practically possible to disprove evolution as a whole. Evolution is as much a certain fact of nature as gravity, atoms, cells, germs, oxygen, and tectonic plates. But if you could disprove evolution, that wouldn't lend any credence at all to your unsupported alternative, which is not even possible. Not just because it defies both physics and logic, but also because no such possibility has ever been shown to exist, and each of the testable claims have been disproved. But even if creationism hadn't already been disproved, if you could somehow disprove evolution, that would only mean that the issue of biodiversity was unexplained, not that it is explained by magic. Explanations must be testable and potentially falsifiable. You can't test the supernatural, so magic doesn't qualify as an explanation.
God will soon prove to all mankind that He exists by supernaturally intervening in world affairs.
How would we know whether anything was ever done supernaturally? Why can't God just show up so we know it's Him? Like back in 2001, God could have appeared in downtown Manhattan, standing 100 meters tall, where He could catch the jets heading for the Twin Towers and gently set them on the ground without hurting anyone. Everyone would have seen it, and we could all be sure that it happened, and it would convert a lot of the terrorists, perhaps, as well. And this kind of evidence would be good enough even for me. So why is it that everything God ever does looks exactly like something that probably would have happened anyway, so that we can never be sure if anything was ever supernatural? Why does it always have to look exactly the same way as it would if God was just pretend?
Do not miss the next broadcast answering, can a Christian believe evolution? It will change you.
Yeah, you said that about this series too. You said it would convince me that there is a God, but everything you say fails. And while it is tempting to build an easy career out of correcting your constant parade of errors, I'm done with you and have nothing left to prove. So this will be my last video targeting you, though I will miss our little talks. I will, however, point out that many of the pioneers of evolutionary biology, as well as some of its most notable advocates and defenders, were, and some still are, Christian, because there are many different brands of Christianity, and you don't get to force your blinkered, contrived, and misguided interpretations on everyone else. I should also point out that the last few popes have endorsed evolution, and that the current one says that evolution is definitely true and that God is not a magician with a magic wand. And before you discount Catholicism, let's not forget that the Catholics outnumber every other Christian collective combined. That's every kind of Protestant, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, everybody all together. The majority of Christians, even among them, accept evolution as one of the tools God used. So can a Christian believe evolution? Most Christians do. Your dwindling and diminishingly scarce little cult of dogmatic bibliolaters does not dictate to the mainstream.
Through reason, science, plain logic, and Scripture, we have absolute proof that only a being of supreme intelligence could stand as designer and architect of the universe with all its complex life, including the pinnacle, the human mind. Now, what will your mind do with so much undeniable proof?
Well, that is the question that prompted my video series, disputing, refuting, and absolutely disproving your supposedly indisputable, irrefutable, absolute proof of God. And now you say it's undeniable, but I have to deny that too. Not to be contrary, just being honest, since none of your fallacious nonsense qualifies as proof of anything but your own ineptitude. I also exposed your circular reasoning, pseudoscience, and citations of fairy tales, so that there is no reason, and really no way, that you could convince any educated, rational person of this magic imaginary genie of yours. There evidently is no God, Mr. Pack, nor could there be. So, with all due respect, shut the fuck up.